The Cold War played out not only in American foreign policy, but also in American domestic policy. That is, there was a Cold War at home as well as abroad. Let's look at some of the components of this Cold War at home as well. We have to begin when we talk about domestic politics, not so much domestic policy as domestic politics, with the Red Scare that began at about the same time as the Cold War itself. This was a domestic reaction to the same kind of unease as we were feeling in our foreign policy. This was the fear of a threat of communist subversion and communists taking over the world. Stalin's secret speech of February 1946 to the Politburo, in which he threatened, not really threatened, but he bragged about being able to infiltrate the rest of the world and to take over the world. And he posited this never-ending battle between communism and capitalism, represented by the United States, that communism would ultimately win, given a little help from its friends like the USSR, frightened not only our foreign policy establishment, but frightened our domestic establishment as well. And we fell into a Red Scare beginning in approximately 1947. This Red Scare began with President Truman responding to pressure and political jargon, rhetoric that he was soft on communism and that his administration was cut through with old line communists who were ready to sell out the United States. Truman demanded of all federal employees that they sign a loyalty oath. That is, that they pledge that they were not a member of the Communist Party. Now, this is an act of prior restraint, but also it's against the Fourth Amendment and was recognized as such at the time, though it was never adjudicated as such because it was the punishment was merely losing your job. But at the same time, everyone knew that communists were notorious liars, and you put all of that in quotes. That was the stereotype. So why the only person who wouldn't be caught was a good communist, because they would simply lie on the loyalty oath. At least that was the common wisdom of the time. Nevertheless, he demanded these loyalty oaths. And let me make an aside to say that in the middle of the 1990s, actually the late 1990s, I lived very close to the Georgia state line in Alabama, and I took an adjunct teaching job as a second job over at Columbus State University. And when I became an employee of a state university in Georgia, I had to sign a loyalty oath that was copyrighted 1953. So those things don't go away very quickly when they get into the body politic. Another aspect of the domestic Red Scare was the reinvigoration of the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, H-U-A-C, which had been a committee established in the early 1930s to root out un-American activity, whatever that means. Mostly it means subversion from the left, or even in some unfortunate cases, it means prosecuting and persecuting people outside of the mainstream of American politics, always with the threat that they have, under the threat, I guess, that they are poisoning the American body politic. The House Un-American Activities kind of faded away during World War II, but it re-revived in 1946-47. Now, when we say House Un-American Activities Committee, we mean a committee of the House of Representatives. The first this committee restarted with two great splashes. The first was that the Ku Klux Klan was not considered fair game for this committee. The committee said, we'll investigate all un-American activities, but the Ku Klux Klan are off limits. This was partly because some of the members of the committee were from those states that had large Klan populations in them. The most important thing that they did, however, was to hold hearings concerning communist influence in our entertainment media. And I say that with all sarcasm. They were terribly afraid and scoring tremendous political points by pursuing communist influence over our children, insidious influence through the airwaves. And they eventually began questioning writers, actors, producers, directors about their own involvement in the Communist Party, which during the 1930s had not been particularly problematic and was one of those styling things that young people did. They joined the Communist Party, and they weren't. No one really saw this as a threat at that time, though it may have been one of those things that put the adults off. And 11 Hollywood writers, directors, and producers refused to give evidence about themselves, or, as this hearing went on, about other people, not based on the Fifth Amendment. By 1947, it was illegal to be a member of the party and not register. The Smith Act of 1940 required you to register if you were a communist, if you were a member of the party. Anyway, 11 of these people refused, not under the Fifth Amendment to answer, but under the First Amendment. Now, the First Amendment offers no protection against self-incrimination like the Fifth Amendment does, but it does offer freedom of association, and that was their claim. Many other people claimed Fifth Amendment protection against the questions, not the answers. And these did not. They became known as the Hollywood 10, and they were persecuted for refusing to take the Fifth or refusing to answer whether they or any of their friends had been were now or had ever been members of the Communist Party. Now you say, wait a minute, you said 11 and now you're saying 10. One of these folks was a German national who fled back to Germany and eventually settled in Eastern Germany. The Hollywood 10 ended up beginning a process by which various committees in the House and the Senate would chase down people they thought were communists and would prosecute them, or at least bring them in and question them. And depending on what their answers were, Hollywood and many other places would blacklist these folks, refusing to allow them to work, at least under their own name, any longer. Dalton Trumbo, for example, was blacklisted as part of the Hollywood 10 in 1947, and it was not until the 1960s when Kirk Douglas hired him to write the screenplay for Spartacus that Dalton Trumbo was allowed to be Dalton Trumbo in the credits. He was still working, but not under his real name. And it was only in the 1960s with Spartacus that he put his real name on there. And this was pretty daring for Kirk Douglas as producer to allow Trumbo to do that. It brought some heat onto Douglas. Okay, we'll talk more about this kind of Red Scare in just a couple of minutes. Labor was curtailed under the Red Scare. In 1947, Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act that pretty much gutted the Wagner Act of the NLRA of 1935, made it much more difficult for unions to operate, and created what we call the right to work. That is it stopped the union control of jobs through a closed shop or even a union shop. A closed shop is an arrangement between an employer and a union in which the union provides labor, acts as an employment agency, and consequently all of the people it provides are members of that union. A union shop is a workplace in which to work there, you must ultimately join the union. And right to work prevents either of those from happening. So there's no real pressure to ever join a union in a right to work area. States could opt into right to work, and many of them did, more and more now than in the past. Also, the CIO, which had grown out of the AFL in 1935 and had grown into its own organization, purged its staff and expelled 13 unions from its rolls for communist activity. Pretty much got rid of all of its staff. All of the CIO staff had either been were members of the party right then, or had been members of the Communist Party in the past. And 13 of the member unions, in addition to the staff, were controlled by people associated with the Communist Party. And that was in 1949. And this purge didn't have to happen, except that it was politically easy to do and scored a bunch of points with Congress and with the public. In addition, there were a number of anti-red, quote-unquote, trials. Now, why do we call them red? Red was the color of revolution and had been for 2 centuries. Red was the color of communism. And people who were communists were often referred to as Reds. People who were fellow travelers who believed that maybe the communists had something to offer were frequently called Pinks. And the counter-revolutionaries were frequently called Whites. So I laugh, having grown up during the Cold War when red meant communist. I laugh at the current blue state, red state divide in which the Republican Party has had thrust upon it the color red. I think that's pretty funny. I like the irony in that. Anyway, one of these great anti-red trials was the Alger Hiss perjury trial of 1949, and then the repeat of that trial in 1950. Alger Hiss was a member of the State Department. He was one of those liberal, capital E, establishment members that had gone to Ivy League schools and had a career. His father had been in the State Department. He had this rising career. And an editor at Time, Whittaker Chambers, accused Hiss of selling secrets to spies, probably Soviets. And Chambers said that he himself had been a courier between Hiss and his handlers on the Soviet side. Well, this was at I believe maybe a House Un-American Activities Committee hearing or a Senate committee hearing on the State Department, and the committee accused Hiss of perjury. So in 1949, he testified to the committee. The committee accused him of perjury. He went on trial in 1950, and it was during this period of time, especially the committee hearing, in which Richard Nixon, as a junior senator, made his chops in ferreting out a lot of anti-Hiss evidence, some of which may or may not have actually been real evidence. Hiss was convicted of perjuring himself before this committee and ultimately served some time in jail. A little less lucky were Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who went on trial in 1950 for selling the atomic bomb secrets to the Soviets. Now, Julius Rosenberg did sell some secret papers to a Soviet handler. Ethel knew this happened, but these were pretty much all the way around regarded as things the Soviets already knew. They were atomic secrets, but they were low-end atomic secrets. Anyway, in the hysteria of 1950, remember 1949 was the year in which the Soviets detonated an atomic bomb and the Red Chinese defeated the nationalists for control of mainland China. We were in the U.S. pretty hysterical. Also, a British spy, Klaus Fuchs, had been caught and actually had sold some pretty significant engineering texts to the Soviets, and it's probably those more than the Julius and Ethel Rosenberg material that enhanced the Soviets' ability to put a bomb together faster than they would have any other way. Anyway, so Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were tried and convicted of espionage in 1950, and they were executed thereafter in 1953 for this. Also in domestic politics was the passage of the Internal Security Act of 1950, also known as the McCarran-Wood Act, that required communist organizations, not individual communists, but communist organizations, to register with the U.S. Attorney General. That is, if they didn't like your politics, you had to register with the U.S. Attorney General. Now, this stuff takes on a kind of a hard and crazy edge beginning in February of 1950, when the junior senator from Wisconsin, who was about to run for his second term in the Senate, had done almost nothing to retain his seat and needed some kind of push, some kind of big media blitz to gain enough attention to put him on the map for voters back home. So in Wheeling, West Virginia, in February 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin gave a speech that opened the era of McCarthyism. At Wheeling, West Virginia, before the Republican Women's Club, he, in the middle of a speech in a throw-off line, pulled out a piece of paper from his pocket and said, I have a list of, and people came to realize he said 250, names of State Department employees who are members of the Communist Party. Now, this was nonsense. He did not have a list of 250 names, but a newspaper picked this up and it caught on. And a few weeks later, he was asked to produce this list. He finally said what he really said was 8 members of the party, and he finally named one person who actually wasn't a member of the party. But nevertheless, by the time he ought to have been humiliated, mass hysteria had caught on, and McCarthy's star began to rise. He was reelected that year, and he was put on the Government Committee on Operations. I phrased that wrong. The Government Committee on Operations for the Senate Committee on Governmental Operations, on which he had 2 members of his staff named Roy Cohn, who was an attorney, and David Shiney, who was Roy Cohn's friend. McCarthy was a red hunter and a red baiter, and he would go well beyond Senate decorum, but not necessarily beyond what the people at the time wanted. In ferreting out red activity, and where he couldn't ferret it out because it probably didn't exist, he would create innuendo. He would bring in things that didn't have anything to do with subversive activities. Particularly, he attacked many people for being homosexual. And so it would stop being about communism and start being about homosexuality, even if it wasn't true. If he could smear you with a brush and he disliked you, he would do it. If you criticized him, you would be threatened with being hauled before him. So people in the Senate, people in the House, people in government were both afraid of him, and they understood that this was great politics in an era when being on the edge was a good thing. Okay, this all fell apart in 1954 with the Army McCarthy hearings. That is, McCarthy asked, David Shiney had been drafted. McCarthy asked that he be stationed in Washington, D.C. because he was of use to the committee. The Army refused to station him in D.C. and said that he would be stationed in New York. So eventually McCarthy accused the Army of being soft on communism. You see where I'm going with this? Another special committee was appointed under a senator named Carl Mundt, M-U-N-D-T, and this committee investigated. McCarthy hijacked the hearing, and he began cross-examining witnesses. Finally, he started cross-examining the opposing counsel, a very much grandfatherly, soft, mild-mannered guy with a bow tie named Joseph Welch. Well, this was also on television, and McCarthy looked awful. He didn't play well on TV anyway. Plus, as the pressure of the hearings went on, he stopped sleeping. When he did sleep, he would sleep on a couch in his office in his clothes. He would come in unshaven or partially shaven, and he was just an attack dog. And all of this was captured on television. Finally, McCarthy, at one point in the hearing, began making innuendos about one of the junior partners in Welch's law firm. And Welch called him on it and said, quote, "Finally, sir, have you no decency?" About dragging this young man's name through the mud. And that was like a pinprick in a balloon. The whole thing just exploded. By the end of that day of hearings, McCarthy was the only person in the whole United States who did not know that his career was over. It just totally deflated at that point, and his former allies allowed it to happen, including Dwight Eisenhower, who, though he was never an ally, as president, he allowed this to go on without any disciplining of it because it was good to beat up on mostly Democrats. Nevertheless, this ruined Joseph McCarthy, and he died before his second term was over, mostly of dissipation. Roy Cohn, who had been pushing the anti-homosexual attacks on people so vehemently, eventually died of AIDS in New York. Well, we've gotten through the repression of the Red Scare, but let's talk about foreign policy after containment. Containment, we know, was initially a policy proposed in 1947. It was supposed to be a multi-pronged strategy to contain communism. It was militarized in 1950. That is, the military option was pushed to the fore with NSC 68. And the military option took hold. American policymakers decided, yes, economic pressure, political pressure, diplomatic pressure, those were all arrows in the quiver, but the big bolt was going to be the military. And this led to some interesting foreign policy and military doctrine and dogma developments. The first thing we want to look at in this is what's called Brinksmanship. In fact, the whole of the 1950s foreign policy apparatus was based on Brinksmanship. This was proposed and implemented by John Foster Dulles, who was Eisenhower's Secretary of State, and his policy was to use Brinksmanship to liberate communist-held areas, not just to contain them. And we would rely on nuclear deterrent to do this. And what he proposed was much like nuclear chicken. That is, we would rattle our sabers, the Soviets would rattle their sabers, maybe the Soviets would start it at some point, rattling their saber, and we would rattle our saber. And the point was to try to get the Soviets to turn loose of these areas that they had taken over by hook and by crook. At least that's what we thought. It required us to refuse to back down from any confrontation until the very last moment. Again, nuclear chicken. And it relied on two doctrines: massive retaliation and mutually assured destruction. Massive retaliation was the idea that we can rattle our sabers, they can rattle their sabers, but if the Russians launch a nuclear attack on the United States, we would unleash every warhead or bomb that we had. We would not, even if they detonated one bomb, we would unleash everything we had. We knew that they would also unleash everything they had. And the person left standing after all of the nuclear weapons were expended would be the winner. That's mutually assured destruction. And this was a dogma and doctrine of the U.S. military and of the U.S. foreign policy establishment. We win if we kill all of them and they don't kill all of us. I'm not sure if I want to live in that world, but we sure made a bunch of movies about that world. This led to the implementation of war on the cheap, highly technological warfare doctrines that were designed to replace boots on the ground with technology. And in the 1950s, the Eisenhower administration called this the New Look military, and it is part and parcel of Brinksmanship. There would be no need to have large numbers of ground forces because we weren't going to use ground forces in an all-out attack. No, we would rely on nuclear weapons, on the nuclear deterrent, mutually assured destruction, and we would rely on proxy armies and proxy wars. That is, other countries would fight small wars in which we backed up one side and Soviets would back up another. We knew this was going to happen. This is completely contrary to NSC 68, which called for a large buildup of ground troops to fight the conventional war. But, you know, a lot of water had passed under the bridge between 1950 and 53 when Ike could begin developing the new look. It took a couple of years to really develop the concept. And with the prevalence of nuclear weapons, we thought we could work this out just fine. Well, it turns out that the new look concept and reliance on nuclear deterrence and Brinksmanship really tied our hands and tied the hands of the Soviet Union. We couldn't fight a conventional war if the two biggest bullies on the block were going to fight each other. It's not Red Dawn.
we were just going to nuke each other. And so this meant, that we had to use proxy wars to fight the hot end of the Cold War. But it also meant that we couldn't ever really get at one another for good or ill. It's a pretty bizarre thing to grow up in. But the nuclear threat was pretty extreme by 1955. People had gone kind of crazy, and it never really got much better. I remember as a child worrying about building a fallout shelter because I lived in Huntsville, Alabama, and we were certain we were going to be nuked. That there was a Russian nuclear warhead aimed right at us. Well, even as early as 1955, with this concept of Brinksmanship, because there was a change in Soviet leadership to the much more mellow Nikita Khrushchev. Mellow is a relative term. Then Eisenhower began playing a two-handed game of poker, you might say. He pushed forward Brinksmanship throughout the rest of the decade, but at the same time, he was willing to meet with his counterpart, the premier of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, in order to discuss nuclear issues. So in 1955, Khrushchev and Eisenhower met at Geneva, Switzerland, in the first of what we would come to call summit conferences. Now, the Geneva Summit of 1955 was the first time in 10 years that the American head of state and the Soviet head of state had sat down and met together. The first time since the Big Four had met at Potsdam. On the Soviet side was Nikita Khrushchev, who Stalin had died in 1953. Khrushchev, a disciple of Stalin, began moving up the ladder fairly quickly, in large part because he was that kind of political knife fighter. And he began a process called de-Stalinization. Though a disciple of Stalin, Khrushchev was not so much a follower as he was a person who understood that Stalin held the keys to the kingdom. And so Khrushchev also understood that Stalin had developed a cult of personality, and that was not good for the state or the people, nor was it good for foreign policy. And so Khrushchev began the process of de-Stalinization. He pulled down a bunch of statues. He declared that you didn't have to have a picture of Stalin in your house. And he, in the foreign policy realm, began talking about peaceful coexistence. That is, negating Stalin's 1946 speech, saying that the two different world systems could not exist simultaneously. One would have to defeat the other. In de-Stalinization, Khrushchev went backwards on that and said, no, we can peacefully coexist. These two systems can have peaceful coexistence. On the American side, Dwight Eisenhower, always known as Ike, went to this conference. He proposed what he called the Open Skies Initiative. This had to do with flyovers. How high into the air did the rights of a country extend? I wanted it to be from about 30,000 feet up, from 30,000 feet down, that a country's rights extended into airspace. Well, the reason he wanted this was that the United States had developed high-flying reconnaissance airplanes like the U-2, which, amazingly enough, is not named for the band. And Ike knew that within just a few years that we, at least, were going to develop missile technology that would allow us to launch a satellite into space, and we did not want the Soviet Union or any other country to accuse us of an act of war should we fly over their territory. Well, this initiative wasn't going to go anywhere. but at least it was a foot in the door to begin a conversation. So what were the results of this Geneva Summit Conference? Well, much like the Locarno Conference of 1925, that actually had some real results. The real thing that came from Geneva was the so-called spirit of Geneva, this idea that maybe we can sit down and talk. Nothing really hard and fast came directly out of the Geneva Conference, but in the spirit of Geneva in 1958, the USSR unilaterally halted atmospheric tests of nuclear devices. That is, they quit testing them in the air and began testing them underground. Eventually, the U.S. followed suit, no longer testing nuclear devices in the air, but testing them underground. And this spirit of Geneva led ultimately to the strategic arms limitation talks of the 1970s. Okay, so the Cold War at home ends up in domestic politics as the Red Scare. We see the Red Scare come to its ugly apogee under McCarthy. Maybe we call that the nadir under McCarthy and the aptly named McCarthyism. In foreign policy, American policy, we see Brinksmanship replace containment and its reliance on mutually assured destruction, massive retaliation, and the new look military. But we got to get this thing under control. And we tried to do that with the Soviets at the Geneva Summit Conference of 1955. Relations between Ike and Khrushchev thawed quite a bit, though it would be pretty rocky for the next few years as the U.S. and the USSR continued in their Cold War patterns. And with that, I thank you very much.